Hey guys, welcome back to Carib 21 Network. So in today's episode, this is going to be our most serious episode that we have done since the 1 year that we have been doing Caribbean trending news on Carib 21. And today, the topic that I want to talk about today is the community of Latin America and the Caribbean zone of peace. And this is very important to me because I feel like I'm sitting down and watching the Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago, the Most Honorable Kamala Persad Bissessar, destroying over 200 years of legacy that our ancestors fought for us to be here today. And for those of us who are very in tune to Caribbean, West Indian history, when I'm talking about our ancestors, I'm talking about Africans that were brought to the Caribbean as slaves. I'm talking about East Indians that were promised a better life in the Caribbean and came to the Caribbean and they died on the fields and could not pay their debt to return back to India. I'm talking about those who came from China and as indentured laborers. I'm talking about the Irish that came to the Caribbean as indentured laborers. So whether you're from Jamaica, Barbados, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, Antigua, Barbuda, from the British West Indies, our history is very intertwined and we all experience the same in the British West Indies. And I'm sitting down and watching the Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago destroying over 200 years of legacy when she is coming out and saying that the Caribbean is not a zone of peace. And in 2024, when the community of Latin America and the Caribbean met last in Havana, Cuba, she was the Prime Minister at the time, and she knows well that the Caribbean and Latin America agreement, zone of peace, has nothing to do with crime, with local crime. So when the Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago is trying to conflate the issue that crime, local crime, whether kidnapping, whether robbery or anything that is taking place in Trinidad and Tobago has anything to do with the zone of peace, the Prime Minister knows well because, as I said, she was there in 2014. The Caribbean zone of peace, Caribbean and Latin America community zone of peace has nothing, let me repeat, nothing to do with crime and violence anywhere in the Caribbean. And to see journalists, to see politicians, to see intelligent people that support the UNC government coming to the Prime Minister's aid and saying that, look, they agree with the Prime Minister that the Caribbean is not a zone of peace just because there's an increase of crime and violence in Trinidad and Tobago. And to me, that is very disingenuous because, as I said, we all have access to the document and this has nothing, absolutely nothing to do with local crime and violence anywhere in the Caribbean, from Trinidad and Tobago to Jamaica to St. Vincent and the Grenadines to Barbados, anywhere within the Caribbean and the Latin American community. And the Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago knows that. And it's not lost on me that when you look at what is going on in Guyana, Guyana is the one that should be in more fear because of their conflict between them and Venezuela and the Essequibo region. And even President Ali has the respect enough to know that even though his country is in threat by Venezuela, the president of Guyana is still committed to the Caribbean and Latin America as a zone of peace.
But my priority as Commander-in-Chief is to ensure the safety of this country, the people of this country, and our territorial integrity. We will do everything necessary to contribute to the region remaining a zone of peace, and we will do everything in support of combating transnational crime and illicit drugs. We have a responsibility to the citizens of this region and the people globally to support and to work with our allies as we have been doing for decades, be it Brazil, Colombia, the US, Suriname, the entire region. We have been collaborating for decades. We've been supporting each other for decades. in the fight against drugs and illicit activities. Whatever we pursue and whatever partnership, in the form of our partnership, once it does not compromise the security of the operation or personnel, of course the public will.
So that was President Ali. Despite the conflict between them and Venezuela, you can see the president coming out and still committed to Caribbean and Latin America as a zone of peace. You can still see President Ali coming out and talking about diplomacy, something that you don't see the Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago talking about. And the reason why this is so frustrating for me is because the Prime Minister knows, like, the Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago is an intelligent woman. She's a very accomplished woman. And as I said, she was there in 2014 in Havana, Cuba, when they were going over the community of Latin America and Caribbean zone of peace. And I understand that some of her supporters might not be educated on this issue of the zone of peace and what it entails. And this is why I'm doing this program today, because I want to make sure that everyone is educated about what this community of Latin America and Caribbean zone of peace is all about. And it's not about crime in Trinidad and Tobago. It's not about crime in Jamaica. It's not about crime in Guyana. This is to protect the Caribbean and Latin America from being colonized. This is to keep armed forces. This is to keep foreign military out of the Caribbean. And that is what this Caribbean zone of peace is all about.
The heads of state and government of the Community of Latin American and Caribbean States gathered in Havana, Cuba on January 28 and 29, 2014 at the Second Summit on behalf of their peoples and faithfully interpreting their hopes and aspirations. Reaffirming the commitment of member countries with the purposes and principles enshrined in the United Nations Charter and international law, and aware of the fact that prosperity and stability in the region contribute to international peace and security. Mindful that peace is a supreme asset and a legitimate aspiration of all peoples, and that preserving peace is a substantial element of Latin America and Caribbean integration and a principle and common value of the Community of Latin American and Caribbean States. Reaffirming that integration consolidates the vision of a fair international order based on the right to peace and a culture of peace, which excludes the use of force and non-legitimate means of defense, such as weapons of mass destruction and nuclear weapons in particular.
And what people need to understand, when the original community of Latin America and Caribbean zone of peace was being put together in Havana, Cuba in 1986, the architects of this agreement was that Michael Manley, was Fidel Castro, and other leaders from the Caribbean and Latin American community. And what this agreement was with the United Nations was to prevent what happened in Cuba in 1898, what happened in Haiti in 1915, what happened in Grenada in 1983, and what happened in Jamaica in 1975. And that is for the occupation of countries from foreign government. So this agreement was put together with the United Nations to say that, look, we are putting this together to make sure that there's no foreign military coming into the Caribbean and Latin America to occupy, to recolonize our countries. And this is what the zone of peace was all about. And the Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago knows that. She was there in 2014 and she knows what this agreement is all about. And nowhere in the Caribbean and Latin America zone of peace talks about anything to do with local crime. And that is the thing that is so frustrating about this, to see intelligent people that really know what is going on, and they're coming on and they're spitting out all this nonsense that because there's an increase of crime and violence in Trinidad and Tobago, that gives the Prime Minister the right to say that the Caribbean and Latin America is not a zone of peace. And when we talk about crime and violence in the Caribbean, the increase of crime and violence in the Caribbean, for the past, I would say 10 to 15 years, we have seen a shift where crime and violence is not only in some of the larger islands. We look and we saw an increase of crime and violence in Jamaica. We saw increase of crime and violence in Trinidad and Tobago. We saw the same thing happening in Guyana. But for the past 10 years or so, we have seen an increase in places like St. Vincent and the Grenadines, St. Lucia, Barbados, where we're not accustomed to crime happening in those islands. When you talk about crime and you talk about like St. Lucia, like that was very foreign to us. And for the past 10 years, I would say a lot of the leaders in CARICOM, especially Mia Mottley and I would say President Ali, they were at the forefront talking about the crime and violence, the increase of crime and violence within the Caribbean community, within the West Indies, and they have been engaging with successive American government because we know that what is contributing to the crime and violence in the Caribbean is the gun for drug trade. And when you see the Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago coming out and everything that she's talking about is about Venezuela and is about, she's pretty much pushing the talking point of the Trump administration when even mainstream media in America will reveal with documents, with evidence that less than 5% of drugs coming out of Venezuela. Venezuela does not produce drugs. When you look, the countries that produce more drugs than anywhere that affecting America, we talk about Mexico, we talk about Colombia, talk about fentanyl from China, talk about other places, like even in America, there are more fentanyl production in America. And to see the Prime Minister not even holding America accountable, because what we have been talking about in the Caribbean for the past 10 years, as I said, with the Prime Minister of Barbados, Mia Mottley, leading at the forefront, is the gun for drug trade. And the Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago is not holding the Americans accountable in any way for their part in it, in terms of 99.9% of the legal firearms that the gangs are using in the Caribbean. Those guns are coming out of America. And as I said, this is so frustrating, as I said, because the Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago, she is pushing the Trump talking point as if the Trump administration, they go in and they invade Venezuela and they overthrow the Maduro government, that is going to fix the problem in the Caribbean, that is going to stop the flow of illegal firearms coming out of America from the Caribbean. Everything that the Prime Minister is saying is as if Donald Trump came out and say, like, I don't like what is happening in the Caribbean and I'm going to help you guys to fix crime and violence in the Caribbean. And nowhere did Donald Trump say that. I doubt if Donald Trump can point out Trinidad on the world map. I doubt if Donald Trump can point out Jamaica or St. Vincent on the Grenadines on the world map. Donald Trump does not care about the Caribbean and what they are doing now in Venezuela. Most of us with a brain knows that is not going to change crime and violence in the Caribbean if we don't stop the illegal flows of guns and ammunition from America, which none of the American president in the past 20 years have shown any resolve that they are willing to help with the illegal flow of firearms in the Caribbean. And that is why this is so frustrating. My hope is for everyone that is watching this video, that is following what is going on in the Caribbean, what is going on with Venezuela and the American government right now. I hope that you'll go do some research. The documentation of the community of Latin America and Caribbean Zone of Peace is online. It's a very long, extensive document. And as I said, this document, when you read this document, you can clearly see that this document was drafted in terms of what I explained, to prevent Latin American countries and the Caribbean countries from being occupied by foreign governments. It's stated in the document about nuclear weapon, about weapon of mass destruction, about foreign military into the Caribbean and Latin America. Nowhere did this talk about local crime and violence in the Caribbean or Latin America. And as I said, this is why I believe that the Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago is doing something very dangerous, not just to Trinidad and Tobago, but to every single Caribbean and Latin American community. Like, she's giving Donald Trump the green light that, and the thing is, if they can go and invade Venezuela today, there could be a reason for them to invade Cuba tomorrow. There could be a reason for them 10 years down the line to invade Trinidad and Tobago. And that is what the community of Latin America and Caribbean zone of peace is about, to keep foreign governments out of the Caribbean and Latin America. So guys, sound off in the comment section and let me know your thoughts on this one. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more amazing content. And remember, peace. I'm out.